This island vanished, not over decades, not through war. In just one single day, it was gone. An entire civilization, its cities, its people, its language, erased almost instantly. But what happened? How does an entire island just disappear? Before we get to that moment, there's something you should know, because this place wasn't ordinary. Before it vanished, it was one of the most advanced societies on Earth. The island was called Thera, now known as Santorini, and more than 3,600 years ago, it was home to a people called the Minoans, brilliant traders and builders who lived in what looked like paradise. They had multi-story homes, running water, and art so vivid it still shines today. They painted dolphins on their walls, not battles. They built ports instead of fortresses. This was a world that didn't need war to feel powerful. From their capital city, Akrotiri, ships sailed across the Aegean, carrying wine, olive oil, and pottery, so fine it ended up in Egypt and Syria. The Minoans were the link between worlds, rich, peaceful, and confident that nothing could touch them. For years, Thera seemed untouched by time. The sun rose over its crescent cliffs, the sea stayed calm, and the Minoans went about their lives believing they lived at the center of the world. From the harbor of Akrotiri, ships came and went every morning, sails white against the blue horizon, carrying wine, olive oil, and pottery to Crete and beyond. On the streets, merchants called out prices. Children chased goats through narrow alleys, and fresco painters brushed scenes of saffron gatherers onto fresh plaster. Everything looked perfect. But perfection has cracks, and Thera was starting to show them. The first signs were small. Wells that once ran clear began to taste metallic. A few fishermen complained that the sea near the island had turned strangely warm. Animals grew restless. Goats refused to graze near certain slopes. People shrugged it off. Every island had moods. Still, something felt off. Some mornings, the air smelled faintly of sulfur. At night, faint rumbles passed through the ground. Not strong enough to frighten, just enough to make lamps flicker. The elders called them blessings from the earth goddess, a reminder that the island was alive. But a few of the younger sailors whispered about the mountain. They said it had started humming again. One afternoon, a farmer plowing near the southern edge of the island noticed his ox stop and freeze. The ground beneath them trembled, soft at first, and hard enough to knock him to his knees. It lasted only seconds. The next day, the same thing happened, stronger this time. Within weeks, the tremors became common. Pots rattled on shelves, plaster cracked on walls. In Akrotiri's central square, a small shrine collapsed. No one was hurt, but the people gathered around it in silence. They built this island with faith in the earth. Now the earth was reminding them who really owned it. Some believed it was nothing. Islands shake. The Aegean is a restless place. Others weren't so calm. Sailors reported that parts of the seafloor near the coast had begun to rise, bubbling, steaming, spitting up dead fish. They said the water turned milky white, like ash suspended in it. No one wanted to admit what that meant. Still, daily life continued. Trade ships left port. Markets opened. Priests performed ceremonies to honor the goddess of renewal, the one who slept inside the mountain. They offered flowers and wine, hoping to calm her. But each prayer seemed to make the ground answer louder. By midsummer, the tremors became stronger and more frequent. Some people began to leave the island, sailing south toward Crete, until the mountain calms. Families took only what they could carry: a few pots, jewelry, clothes, small offerings for the gods. Most promised they'd return when it was safe. Most never did. Those who stayed behind were the confident ones or the stubborn. They'd lived through smaller tremors before. Nothing had ever happened. Why would this time be different? In the heart of Akrotiri, the fresco painters continued their work. On one wall, they painted blue monkeys climbing trees, birds in flight, and women gathering saffron, scenes of beauty. life and plenty. Maybe they painted to forget the noise beneath their feet. They couldn't hear what was happening below the surface. Magma rising through cracks, gas building in sealed chambers, pressure stretching the island like a balloon. Each tremor was the earth tightening its grip. At night, fishermen noticed strange lights flickering under the water. Dull orange glows deep below the waves. They thought they were spirits or reflections of the moon. But no one could explain why the sea sometimes rippled, even when there was no wind. A few priests climbed the mountain to perform offerings. They found the air hot and thick, filled with steam that burned their throats. They came back pale and shaking. "She's waking," they said. "We must prepare." But how do you prepare for something you've never seen before? The final weeks before the eruption must have felt like waiting for a storm that never arrived, until it did. The ground shook almost daily. Cracks appeared in the streets. Springs dried up. A strange low roar could be heard at night, like wind through hollow stone, coming from underground. Then came the smell. Sulfur, sharp and sour, clinging to the air. It coated everything: clothes, hair, skin. Fires burned slower. Birds disappeared completely. And then, stillness. The mountain went quiet. The air cleared. For days, nothing happened. The people relaxed. They opened their shops again, cleaned their homes, laughed at how paranoid they'd been. "The goddess has gone back to sleep," the priest said. "Her anger is over." They couldn't have been more wrong. Because the silence wasn't peace. It was pressure. The volcano had sealed itself. Now it was waiting for one last breath. In the early hours of a clear morning, the sky turned dark, not from clouds, but from ash. The first explosion ripped through the mountain with a sound no one alive could have imagined. The air itself seemed to tear apart. People ran from their homes. Some looked up and saw the sky raining stones, small at first, then larger, until they smashed roofs and shattered pottery. The volcano had erupted before, centuries earlier, but this was different. This was the one that would split the island in half. Thera's mountain didn't just blow upward, it collapsed inward. The sea rushed into the void, met molten rock, and exploded again, sending towers of steam and ash miles into the air. The shockwave flattened everything near the crater. Those who lived near the center never stood a chance. Farther out, people fled to boats, but the waves came too fast. From Crete, nearly 70 miles away, sailors saw the sky darken. They thought the world was ending. For 3 days, the eruption continued. The sun disappeared. The sea boiled. The island that once glowed white and blue turned black and gray. When the final collapse came, half of Thera sank into the sea, leaving behind the hollow crescent we know as Santorini today. In just one day, the island was gone. And what it left behind wasn't just destruction, it was silence. The ash buried everything: homes, art, and people. But that same ash also preserved them. When archaeologists uncovered Akrotiri thousands of years later, they found walls still painted, stairs still standing, even utensils where families had left them. It was like Pompeii before Pompeii, a frozen moment of life interrupted. But unlike Pompeii, they found almost no bodies. That means the people of Thera must have known, at least a few of them, that the mountain was about to erupt. Maybe they escaped by sea. Maybe they tried to outrun the wave. Either way, when the island went silent, their world went with it. In the days that followed, massive tsunamis spread outward, smashing into Crete, the heart of the Minoan Empire. Ports vanished. Crops drowned. The air filled with volcanic ash that dimmed the sun for months. Trade collapsed. The climate shifted. The civilization that had once dominated the Aegean began to fall apart, not because of war, but because of one mountain. The Minoans would never recover. Centuries later, the story survived only as fragments. Sailors whispering about an island swallowed by the sea. temples buried, and cities shining underwater. By the time Plato wrote of Atlantis, 1,000 years had passed. He described a powerful island nation that sank in a single day and night. To him, it was myth. But to history, it was Thera. The eruption was over. But the destruction had only begun. When the mountain on Thera finally went silent, what remained was a shattered crescent of blackened stone. The sea still hissed with heat. Ash fell like gray snow for days, thick enough to block the sun. The air smelled like burned metal and salt. Out on the horizon, the waves that the volcano had sent across the Aegean were still moving. Walls of water, racing outward in every direction. By the time they reached Crete, the center of Minoan civilization, no one had time to escape. Fishermen saw the sea vanish first. The water near the harbors threw back so far that ships rested on bare sand. People ran out to gather fish that flopped helplessly on the exposed seabed, laughing at the strange sight. Then the ocean came back. It rose not as waves, but as a single roaring wall, 10, 20, 30 meters high. It hit the coast of Crete like a hammer. Ships shattered against stone piers. Whole towns were erased in seconds. The surge raced inland, flooding warehouses, temples, and homes. When it retreated, it dragged everything back with it. People, animals, carts, debris. And then came another wave. And another. By the time the water finally calmed, much of the island's coastline was gone. For the Minoans, the sea had always been a friend, a source of food, trade, and connection. Now it had turned against them. The survivors climbed to the highlands, where they watched smoke still rising from the northern horizon, the direction of Thera. What had once been their richest trade partner was now a black scar on the sea. For weeks afterward, the sun stayed dim. The ash cloud from Thera spread across the sky, blocking light and changing the weather. Rains came at the wrong time. Crops failed. Livestock died. To the Minoans, it must have felt like the gods had turned away. The eruption hadn't just destroyed one island. It had shattered a network. The Minoan world relied on the sea, their ports, their merchants, their crops. The volcano had erased all of it at once. The people of Crete tried to rebuild. They cleared harbors, repaired ships, and opened their temples again. But trade never fully returned. Egypt, their southern ally, had suffered floods from the same tsunamis. To the north, the mainland Greeks were growing stronger, hungrier, and far more aggressive. The balance had shifted, and the Minoans didn't realize it yet. In the years that followed, strange things began happening across Crete. Records scratched into clay tablets spoke of earthquakes, famine, and unrest. Temples that once overflowed with offerings stood empty. Farmers refused to plant in soil that tasted like ash. And then, one by one, the great palaces, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, began to burn. No one knows exactly how or why. Some archaeologists believe the fires were caused by invaders from the Greek mainland, known as the Mycenaeans. Others think the destruction came from within, revolts, desperation, maybe even the Minoans turning against their own rulers after losing faith in the gods. But all evidence points to one thing. The eruption on Thera had weakened them so much that they could never recover. They had been a civilization of peace, art, and trade, not war. When the world changed, they didn't know how to fight for their survival. Still, some kept the faith. A few priests in Knossos wrote that the goddess of renewal would return when the sea was calm again. They rebuilt shrines, painted new frescoes, and tried to restore what was lost. But even their art had changed. Before the eruption, Minoan art had been full of color and joy. Dolphins, flowers, dancing women. Afterward, their paintings turned darker. They showed storms, animals fleeing, waves crashing. It was as if their world had lost its rhythm. The old symbols of balance, the double axe, the bull, the spiral, began to fade from their temples. The Minoans' faith in harmony had been shaken to its core. Generations passed. The Mycenaeans eventually took control of Crete, adopting much of the Minoan culture as their own. The writing system, the art, the trade routes that still worked. But the soul of the old Minoan world was gone. Thera's explosion hadn't just buried a city. It had buried an idea that civilization could exist without conquest. The Minoans had proven it was possible for a while. But nature reminded them that no amount of art or peace can stop the earth from changing its mind. By 1400 BCE, the Minoan civilization had completely vanished. The once great palaces of Crete stood empty, vines crawling over broken stone. The sea that had carried their ships now lapped quietly against ruins, as if nothing had happened. Thousands of years later, archaeologists digging through ash on Santorini would find their world again. Rooms painted with blue dolphins, clay jars still sealed, stairways leading nowhere. It looked like time had stopped. And maybe in a way it had. Because the story of Thera never really ended. It simply turned into legend. Sailors spoke of an island swallowed by the sea. Poets told of a place that angered the gods and vanished overnight. By the time the philosopher Plato wrote about Atlantis, he wasn't inventing a myth. He was echoing a memory that had already been passed down for 1,000 years. He wrote of an island nation that shone with beauty and wealth, but vanished in a single day and night of misfortune. An island that worshipped the sea, grew powerful, and then disappeared beneath it. To his readers, it was a moral story. To historians, it sounds familiar. Everything about Atlantis, the wealth, the art, the sea, the sudden destruction, matches the story of the Minoans and their shining island, Thera. The Minoans never left behind a written record explaining what happened. No inscriptions, no epic poem, just silence and ash. But maybe that is what makes their story powerful, because everything we know about them comes from what they built, not what they said. And what they built still speaks. Paintings of a world full of light, joy, and balance. A world that ended in a single day. Thera today is calm again. Tourists walk its white cliffs and drink coffee in cafes built on the edge of what was once the volcano's rim. The sea sparkles the same way it did 3,500 years ago. Most people who visit don't realize they are standing above the bones of a lost civilization, the one that may have inspired Atlantis. The island glows at sunset, golden light spilling over black cliffs. And for a moment, it almost feels like the old Thera, the island of light, has come back. But it never truly did. It just reminds us that even the most advanced civilizations can disappear in a single day. Centuries passed. The ash settled, the seas calmed, and the world moved on. The Minoans faded into silence, their ports buried, their palaces forgotten. But the memory of their fall never truly disappeared. Fishermen in the Aegean still spoke of an island that had glowed white on the horizon and then vanished in smoke. Sailors passing near Santorini told stories of strange shapes beneath the waves, walls, pillars, courtyards glimpsed through clear water on calm days. They didn't call it Thera anymore. They called it the island that fell. The story spread the way stories always do, changing shape with every retelling. To some, it was punishment from the gods. To others, it was proof that even the most blessed kingdoms can anger the sea. And as the years turned into centuries, the tale drifted far beyond the Aegean, carried by merchants, priests, and poets. It moved through generations until the truth blurred into myth. By the time the philosopher Plato sat down to write his dialogues around 360 BCE, the story had already aged 1,000 years. He wasn't an explorer or historian. He was a storyteller, using history as philosophy, myth as mirror. In his work, Timaeus and Critias, he described an island called Atlantis, a land beyond the Pillars of Heracles, meaning beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. A civilization of immense wealth, beauty, and power that vanished in a single day and night of disaster. He wrote that Atlantis had kings, temples covered in gold, and canals carved by human hands. That they became proud, corrupt, and the gods destroyed them in one blow. To his audience, it was a moral lesson, a warning about arrogance and greed. But to historians today, his description sounds eerily familiar. An advanced island civilization, a great naval power, a culture of art, architecture, and trade, and a sudden destruction by fire and sea. It matches the Minoans almost exactly. Plato claimed he'd heard the story from Solon, an Athenian lawmaker who'd learned it from Egyptian priests. Those priests said the event had happened 9,000 years before. Historians now think that number was never meant to be precise, that it was simply a very long time ago. And if you adjust the timeline, that's about the same era the volcano on Thera erupted, around 1600 BCE, so maybe Plato's tale wasn't fiction. Maybe it was a broken memory, carried across centuries, reshaped by each person who told it, until it became myth. When archaeologists uncovered Akrotiri on Santorini in the late 20th century, they realized something extraordinary. The real city beneath the ash looked exactly like the world Plato described. It had paved streets, multi-story homes, and water systems more advanced than anything seen until thousands of years later. Its art showed dolphins, ships, and processions, not war or conquest, but life, beauty, and peace. And when it was buried, it stayed nearly intact, frozen in that single day of disaster Plato had written about. Even the way Thera collapsed, sinking inward, swallowed by the sea, fits the legend perfectly. Atlantis wasn't lost in the Atlantic Ocean. It was here, in the Aegean, hidden under ash. But there's something else. Plato's story wasn't just about destruction. It was about human nature. He said Atlantis fell not because of nature's wrath alone, but because its people had grown proud, believing their perfection made them untouchable. They forgot that the earth doesn't care how advanced we are. And that's what makes the story of Thera and the Minoans so haunting. They were brilliant, peaceful, creative, but they also trusted the ground beneath them too much. They built their paradise on top of a volcano. The same land that gave them everything was waiting to take it back. For thousands of years, the Aegean kept the secret. The sea reclaimed what it wanted, and the story lived only in whispers. Then one day, in 1967, archaeologists began digging on Santorini. They found the city, walls still painted, stairways leading to nowhere, rooms full of pottery, and streets buried under meters of volcanic ash. It was like uncovering a time capsule from another world. And for a moment, history and myth collided. The Lost Island wasn't a fantasy after all. It was real. Today, scientists can explain almost everything. The eruption, the ash, the collapse. But there's still something unexplainable about how the story survived. How a single event from 3,600 years ago managed to echo through legend, travel across continents, and end up as one of the greatest myths ever told. Maybe that's what makes it powerful, not the science, but the survival of the story. Because behind every myth, there's a truth. And behind Atlantis, there was Thera, the island civilization that vanished in a single day. For centuries, Santorini was just another island, quiet, beautiful, and scarred. Travelers admired its white cliffs and blue domes without realizing they were walking on the rim of a volcano that had once destroyed a civilization. The locals told old stories about it, nothing detailed, just whispers. The sea burned here once. Or, there's another city buried under the mountain. But for most of history, no one believed them. The world thought Atlantis was only a legend, and the Minoans, just another name in old Greek texts. It wasn't until the 19th century, when archaeology began to take shape as a science, that people started looking for proof of what the ancient writers had described. That search would lead them back to the Aegean and eventually to Santorini. The first real clue came from a man named Spyridon Marinatos, a Greek archaeologist with an obsession for connecting myths to history. In the 1930s, Marinatos proposed a theory that shocked the academic world. The massive eruption on Thera wasn't just a local disaster. It was the event that had ended the Minoan civilization. According to him, the tsunami, ashfall, and climate change that followed had destroyed Minoan trade, crippled their economy, and invited their enemies, the Mycenaeans, to take over Crete. It was a bold claim. At the time, few believed him. There was no solid evidence of an eruption big enough to cause that kind of collapse. But Marinatos didn't stop. He became convinced that the proof was buried under Santorini's soil. In 1967, he began digging near a small village called Akrotiri, where locals had occasionally found pottery and strange carved stones while farming. At first, he expected to find a few broken walls, maybe a shrine. What he uncovered was something much greater. Layer by layer, the team dug through meters of hardened ash and volcanic rock until they reached color. Red plaster, blue frescoes, the corner of a stairway, then a whole wall, then an entire house, still standing. It didn't look like ruins. It looked like someone had just stepped out moments ago. Over the next few years, archaeologists uncovered a complete city. Streets, multi-story homes, workshops, and storage rooms filled with pottery, tools, and furniture. The level of preservation was breathtaking. The ash had sealed everything in place. Even delicate wooden beds now turned to ash outlines and bronze tools that still shined under the dust. It was a snapshot of life frozen mid-breath. What shocked everyone wasn't just how well it was preserved, but what it revealed. This wasn't some primitive village. Akrotiri was modern, far ahead of its time. There were drainage systems, bathtubs, and flushing toilets. Houses were 3 stories tall, with balconies and painted walls. Frescoes showed a society that valued beauty, not war. Flowers, festivals, dolphins, and women with elaborate hairstyles. The Minoans of Thera hadn't been a forgotten island tribe. They'd been one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world. And then it all ended in a single day. As the excavation expanded, archaeologists began to find clues about how that day unfolded. Inside one house, they found stacked jars and sealed containers, as if the owners had been preparing to leave. In another, they found a storage room filled with food and tools, untouched, suggesting people had fled before the final eruption. There were no human remains anywhere. Unlike Pompeii, which was filled with bodies, Akrotiri was empty. That changed everything. It meant the people of Thera had seen it coming. They must have felt the tremors, seen the ash falling, and decided to abandon the island before it was too late. Some archaeologists believe they fled to Crete, bringing stories of fire and darkness that would echo through generations. Those stories, carried across centuries, might be what later became the legend of Atlantis. Marinatos was right. Mostly, the eruption of Thera had indeed caused a chain reaction that crippled the Minoan world. But he didn't live to see how right he was. In 1974, while working on the excavation site, Marinatos was struck by falling debris during a collapse and died instantly. He was buried on the island he had spent his life trying to understand. His work continued under new archaeologists, each season revealing more of the buried city. Even today, excavations still go on. Only a small portion of Akrotiri has been uncovered, maybe a tenth of what lies beneath the ash. The rest remains sealed, waiting for someone else to find it. The rediscovery of Akrotiri changed how we understood the Bronze Age completely. It showed that human creativity and engineering had reached extraordinary heights long before classical Greece or Rome. And it reminded the world of something else, that nature can erase greatness in a heartbeat. When scientists studied the layers of ash and rock from the eruption, they realized it had been one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history. The explosion released energy equivalent to tens of thousands of atomic bombs. Ash from the blast reached Egypt and China. The eruption sound might have been heard across continents, and the tsunami it unleashed could have reached 15 meters high when it hit Crete. The shockwaves of that single day shaped centuries of history. But the rediscovery wasn't just a story of science. It was a story of humans meeting their own past. When modern workers walked through the narrow stone streets of Akrotiri, they were retracing the same paths Minoans had walked 3,600 years earlier. They stood in homes still colored with blue dolphins and lily, under ceilings that had once glowed in lamplight. It was as if the people of Thera had been waiting, not to return, but to be remembered. And now they were. Yet even after all the discoveries, the frescoes, the houses, the tools, one mystery remains. No one knows where the survivors went. Their ships are gone. Their records are gone. Crete bears no written account of them arriving. It's possible they fled east, towards Cyprus or the Levant, blending into new cultures. Or maybe their fleet was lost in the chaos, swallowed by the same waves that took their island. All that's left is silence, and the city buried under ash. Thera never spoke again. The volcano quieted, the waves calmed, and what was once a crown of light became a broken ring of cliffs. But the silence that followed wasn't just geological. It was human. The island had taken its story down with it. For thousands of years, the people of Thera were gone, their names erased, their voices buried beneath ash. All that remained were fragments, walls painted with color, tools turned to dust, and a mystery that refused to fade. When Akrotiri was uncovered, it felt like the island was exhaling after holding its breath for 3,600 years. Every wall, every jar, every painting whispered the same truth. These were real people, not myth. They lived ordinary days, cooking, trading, painting, never knowing they would be frozen in time. The Minoans built their world on balance, between nature and creation, between sea and land. When that balance broke, so did everything else. But their story didn't die with them. It waited under ash until the world was ready to listen.